Paylocity presents Affordable Care Act Common Questions. Today's question comes from Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and that question is, how does shared responsibility impact member employers in a controlled or affiliated service group? So there's a couple things we want to note here when we talk about controlled or affiliated service groups. First of all, that's defined in the Internal Revenue Code, Section 414, and this definition is often applied in other areas of benefit administration. Now, when determining whether an affiliated employer group meets the definition if in a large employer, and hence subject to shared responsibility, the full-time employee and equivalent counts are done across all member employers and are totaled together. If the sum across all member employers are greater than 50, the employer is hence subject to the shared responsibility provision because they then meet the definition of a large employer. Now, in this example, let's say that David Smith owns 80% of 5 ice cream shops. Even though each shop may only employ 30 people, each shop is still subject to the shared responsibility provision since there's common controlled ownership and their combined full-time employee and equivalent count is greater than 50. Okay. The other key consideration when we talk about affiliated or controlled employer groups is how penalties are calculated. When calculating the shared responsibility assessment in cases where no coverage is offered, that penalty is calculated on the employer member itself and not on the group as a whole. So if we go back to the example of David Smith and his ice cream shops, let's assume for a moment that the employer groups coincide with each of the 5 locations. In this case, let's say that each location has the employee counts that you see listed here. Now, if you recall, when we calculate the penalty owed when no coverage is offered, the first 30 full-time employees are excluded when calculating that assessment or penalty. Now, in an affiliated employer group, that 30 employee exclusion is distributed proportionally between each member employer. So you'll see here in that second row, we have the allocation of those 30 employees that are excluded, which brings us to our assessable employee count for each location, and the calculated assessment for each location based off of the $2,000 per year per full-time employee. Now, assuming that the member employer coincides with the location, if one employee in location C goes to an exchange for coverage, triggering a penalty, and no employee from any other location does the same, the penalty owed in this case would be $32,000 since that's the calculated assessment for that location only. And because the penalty is applied at the member employer and not at the entire group, the penalty again is only $32,000, not the much greater sum that would be owed if it's aggregated across all locations in this case. Be sure to visit the Healthcare Reform resource page on Paylocity.com for more questions and answers and informative videos about the Affordable Care Act.